My husband cheated on me with my own sister for 30 years. The day I accidentally found out, I stayed silent. My lawyer shouted, "Divorce him!" But I just smiled. What I did next made them both. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I survived it. They look at me, a 68-year-old woman with white hair and flour on her apron, and they can't quite believe that I was once the kind of person who nearly lost everything she'd ever built. But I did nearly lose it. And the way I didn't, well, that's the story I'm going to tell you now. My name is Margaret Collins. Everyone who loves me calls me Peggy. For 30 years, I lived in a cream-colored house on Birchwood Lane in a quiet Ohio town where the neighbors still waved from their porches and the church bells rang every Sunday morning. Frank and I had built that life together, board by board, year by year. We had a vegetable garden in the backyard. We had 2 grown children, our son Daniel and our daughter Rachel. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit who shed everywhere and didn't apologize for it. From the outside, and honestly from the inside too, it looked like a good life, a real life. Frank was a civil engineer, methodical, quiet, reliable as a clock. That was what I had loved about him in the beginning. After 30 years, I suppose I had stopped noticing him the way you stop noticing the hum of the refrigerator. He was simply there, part of the furniture of my days. I taught piano lessons from the front room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I made pot roast on Sundays. I called my sister Diane every Saturday morning, without fail, for as long as I could remember. Diane, my little sister, 4 years younger than me, never married, always finding reasons why things didn't work out. I had spent most of my adult life quietly worrying about her. When she went through her difficult stretch after losing her job at the insurance company, Frank and I had lent her money, $3,000 that we never asked back. When she needed a place to stay for just a month 3 years ago, we gave her our guest room for 4. I loved her the way you love someone who has always made your life a little harder and whom you have never once stopped forgiving. The first sign, I now understand, came in the spring. Frank began going to the gym. Frank, who had never owned a pair of athletic shoes in his life, suddenly announced he was getting serious about his health. I was pleased for him. I packed him little bags of almonds to take along. What kind of fool does that make me? The loving kind, I think. The trusting kind. The kind of fool that people like Frank count on. Then there were the evenings he came home late from work. Not often, not obviously, but more than before. He always had an explanation. Traffic on Route 9. A project running long. A colleague's retirement drinks. Each reason was perfectly ordinary. That was the thing about Frank. He was an engineer. He built his lies the same way he built everything else. Load-bearing, structurally sound, designed to last. Diane started calling less. Our Saturday morning conversations shrank from an hour to 20 minutes to a quick, "I'm so busy, Peg. Can we talk next week?" I told myself she was going through something. She was always going through something. Then one Thursday in October, my piano student canceled at the last minute. I drove to the grocery store, came home early, and walked through the back door into my own kitchen. And there on the kitchen table, Frank's phone, face up, because he had gone to use the bathroom and hadn't thought to take it, a text message glowed on the screen. Just 4 words. From a contact saved as D. Tonight was perfect. Miss you. I stood very still in my own kitchen with a paper bag of groceries in my arms, and I read those 4 words 6 times. Then Frank came back into the kitchen, saw me, saw the phone, and the color left his face so fast it was almost interesting to watch. I set the groceries down on the counter. I put the eggs away. I asked him what he wanted for dinner. And when my lawyer called me 3 days later, because yes, I had already called a lawyer, he shouted at me over the phone, "Peggy, just file now. What are you waiting for?" I smiled into the receiver. "Not yet," I said. "I'm not nearly ready yet." I did not sleep that night. I lay on my side of the bed. 30 years of sleeping on the left side had left a permanent groove in the mattress. And I listened to Frank breathe, and I thought about the word D. It took me until about 2 in the morning to let myself know what I already knew. D was Diane. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. There would be tears later, plenty of them, in private, in the shower where no one could hear me. But that first night, lying next to my husband of 3 decades while his phone sat charging on the nightstand, I felt something colder and more useful than grief. I felt the need to understand exactly how much I had lost and exactly what could still be saved. So I began to count. The house on Birchwood Lane was in both our names. We had purchased it in 1997 for $112,000. It was worth somewhere around $380 now, maybe $400 in a good market. The joint savings account held just over $94,000. My piano teaching brought in about $800 a month. Not nothing, but not enough to carry a mortgage alone. Frank's pension from the county was substantial, and in Ohio, after a long marriage, a portion of that pension was marital property. I knew this because I had once helped a friend navigate her own divorce and had sat in the attorney's office and listened. What else? The garden? Biscuit. The way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window in November. The Sunday pot roasts that Frank had always said were the best thing about the week. How long? That was the question that kept returning. How long had this been going on? A month? A year? 3 years? Since Diane had stayed in our guest room? The thought landed in my chest like something heavy dropped from a height. I got up at 5:30, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. Not to write grievances, to write facts, assets, accounts, dates I could remember. The money we had lent Diane, that was marital money, which meant it was my money too. I wrote it all down in my careful teacher's handwriting. Frank came downstairs at 7, surprised to find me already dressed. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," I said. I poured him his coffee. I watched his hands around the mug. Those hands had built shelves in our children's rooms. Those hands had held mine in the hospital when Daniel was born. I looked at them for a long moment, and then I looked away, and something in me quietly closed a door. My lawyer's name was Howard Blum, a compact, sharp-tongued man who had been doing family law in our county for 25 years. He had been my friend Ruth's attorney during her divorce, and she had described him as the kind of man you want in your corner and would absolutely not want to be married to. I called him the morning after I found the text. Howard wanted me to file immediately. He talked about the advantage of moving first, about freezing assets, about getting ahead of Frank's narrative. He was right about all of it, strategically. But I said no. Because here was the thing Howard didn't fully understand. I had no proof of who D was. A 4-word text from a contact saved as a single letter was not proof of anything specific. Frank could claim it was a work colleague. He could claim a dozen things. And Diane, if it was Diane, and I was now almost certain it was, would deny everything and come to Frank's defense. And then it would be my word against 2 people I had trusted most in the world. No, I needed something real, something that couldn't be argued away. And so, quietly, without changing a single thing about my daily routine, the piano lessons, the pot roast, the Saturday calls to Diane, I began to plan. The first thing I did was open a personal savings account at a different bank, the one across town where I rarely went. I transferred $1,000 from a small private account I had kept since before we were married, my mother's money, which had always been mine alone. That account was my foundation. The second thing I did was call my son Daniel and ask him, casually, if he still knew that young man from his college years who had gone into private investigation work. "Just curious," I said. "Just asking." Daniel said yes. He had his number somewhere. Good, I thought, and smiled into the phone. Good. The private investigator's name was Carl Reese. He was about 40, unremarkable looking in the best possible way. The kind of man you would forget the moment he left a room. And he charged $120 an hour plus expenses. I met him at a diner 2 towns over on a Wednesday morning when Frank thought I was at my book club. I told Carl everything I knew, which was frustratingly little. I gave him Frank's schedule, Diane's address. She had moved to a rental apartment on the east side of Columbus, about 40 minutes from us, and the license plate number of Frank's gray Subaru. I told Carl I wanted dates, times, photographs if possible. I told him I was not interested in confrontation. I was interested in documentation. "How long do you want me on this?" Carl asked, stirring his coffee. "As long as it takes to be certain," I said. He nodded like that was a sensible answer, and I liked him for it. Howard Blum, meanwhile, had accepted my decision to wait, though he made clear he thought I was making it harder on myself. "The longer you wait, the more time he has to move money," he told me over the phone. "I'm watching," I told Howard. "I know every account we have." That was nearly true. I had spent the previous week going through our financial records, bank statements, the brokerage account, Frank's county retirement portal, the small IRA in my name, and photographing every page with my phone. Howard's paralegal walked me through what to send and what to keep safe. I kept copies at Ruth's house in a manila envelope labeled recipes, because if Frank went looking for anything, that was the last place he would think to search. Ruth was the only person I told. My closest friend since we were 32, she had sat across from me in her kitchen and listened without interrupting, which is a rarer gift than people realize. When I finished, she put her hand over mine and said, "What do you need from me? Not are you sure? Not maybe there's an explanation. Just, what do you need?" I told her I needed her to hold an envelope and not ask questions about it. She said she could do that. At home, I kept everything exactly as it had always been. This was the hardest part. Not the planning, not the meetings with Carl or Howard, but the performance of ordinary life. The Tuesday and Thursday piano lessons, Biscuit's evening walks, dinner on the table. The particular way I had always said goodnight to Frank before turning off my lamp. But I began to notice something shift in those weeks. Frank was watching me differently. Not guiltily. Frank had never been a guilty-looking man, but carefully. Assessing. Once or twice I caught him glancing at me in the middle of a meal with an expression I hadn't seen before, something calculating behind his eyes. He was wondering if I knew. He hadn't decided yet. And Diane. When I called her that Saturday, she was almost too warm, too chatty, too eager to fill silences. She asked how I was feeling 3 times in one conversation. That is not how Diane talked. Diane talked about herself. She was worried. Something had shifted for her too. Let them wonder, I thought. Wondering was exactly where I needed them. Carl called me on a Tuesday evening in November, 3 weeks after we had met. I stepped outside onto the back porch, ostensibly to bring in the empty flower pots before the frost. Biscuit sat beside me, disinterested and warm. "I have something," Carl said. He emailed the photographs to a new email account I had created for this purpose only, using Ruth's home computer. I drove to Ruth's that Thursday morning after my first student left, and I sat at her kitchen table and opened the file. There were 11 photographs, time-stamped. Frank's gray Subaru in the parking lot of Diane's apartment building, Frank entering the building's front door at 6:47 p.m. on a Monday. Frank and Diane walking together across a parking lot of a restaurant in Columbus, her hand in the crook of his arm, both of them laughing at something. One photograph taken through the restaurant window, the two of them at a corner table, leaning toward each other, Frank's hand over hers. I sat with those photographs for a long time. The room was very quiet, except for Ruth's old kitchen clock and the sound of my own breathing. Was this grief? Yes. Was it also a strange, clarifying relief? The relief of being proven right, of not being crazy, of having the terrible, shapeless thing finally take a definite form? Yes to that, too. I closed the laptop, thanked Ruth, and drove home to make lunch. That afternoon, I called Howard. "I have what I need," I said. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then, "Send it to me." "Already did," I said. Howard filed the divorce petition on a Friday morning in late November. By that evening, Frank had been served at his office. I was not home when it happened. I had arranged to spend that afternoon at Ruth's, not for any dramatic reason, but because I had learned in the weeks prior that I did not want to be in the room when things exploded. I wanted to be calm, somewhere safe, drinking tea, and let the legal system do what it was designed to do. Frank called me 4 times between 4 and 6 o'clock. I did not answer. At 6:15, I drove home, walked through the front door, and found him standing in the kitchen with the petition papers in his hand, his face doing something I had never seen it do in 30 years of marriage. He looked genuinely frightened. "Peggy," he said, "what is this?" "You can read," I said. I hung my coat on the hook by the door. "I'm sure you can figure it out." "You went to a lawyer without saying a word to me. After 30 years. "After 30 years, I agreed. "Yes." I moved to the stove and turned on the burner under the kettle because my hands needed something to do. "I'd like you to stay in the guest room tonight, Frank, or make other arrangements. That part is up to you." He was quiet for a long moment. I could feel him calculating. The same deliberate processing that made him good at his work and had made him, apparently, quite good at deception. "Peggy," he said, and his voice shifted into something softer, more careful. "Whatever you think is happening." "I don't think," I said. "I know. Howard has the photographs. We can discuss it through attorneys." He left the kitchen. He did not leave the house that night. He slept in the guest room. But the following morning he was gone before I came downstairs, and I felt the silence of the house settle around me like something earned. It was Diane who called 2 days later. I almost didn't answer. But I decided I wanted to hear her voice, wanted to know exactly what she would choose to say. "Peggy," she said. She sounded like she had been crying, or was performing having been crying. With Diane, I had sometimes struggled to tell the difference. "I think we need to talk. This has all gotten so out of hand." "Has it?" I said. "You don't understand the whole situation. Frank and I, this isn't what you're making it into. I want to explain." "Diane," I said, "my attorney has photographs of the two of you at Carmine's restaurant in Columbus on November 4th. His hand on yours. Would you like to tell me what I'm misunderstanding about that?" Silence. "I think," I said, "that anything else you'd like to say should go through Howard Blum's office." And I hung up. But that was not the end of it. 2 days after that, Frank appeared at the front door with Diane beside him. He had a key. The house was still legally co-owned, and he let himself into the entryway before I had a chance to object. They stood in my living room, in my house, and Frank spoke in the measured tone of a man who had decided that reason was his best remaining weapon. He told me I was being vindictive. He told me that what I was doing would destroy the family. He told me that Daniel and Rachel would never forgive me for this, for breaking up the home, for the scandal, for the stubbornness. Diane stood slightly behind him and said nothing, which was its own kind of message. Then he told me something that was meant to frighten me, that he had spoken to his own attorney, and that his attorney had advised him to contest the asset division on the grounds that my unilateral financial decisions, meaning my new account, constituted marital misconduct. I looked at him. I looked at Diane. I thought of 11 photographs and a manila envelope at Ruth's house labeled recipes. "That's interesting," I said. "I look forward to hearing that argument presented in court." They left. I locked the door behind them, sat down in my armchair, and for the first time in weeks, I shook. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From the sheer exhaustion of holding yourself together when everything around you is trying to come apart. I called Daniel that evening and told him, carefully and factually, what was happening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, what do you need?" The same question Ruth had asked. The right question. "I need a few days," I told him. "Tell Rachel I'll call soon. I just need a few days to breathe." Daniel drove up that Saturday. We walked Biscuit along the old towpath by the river, and he didn't push me to talk, and I didn't push myself. The November light was thin and clean, and the dog ran ahead of us chasing dead leaves, and for a few hours, I let myself simply exist in the world without a plan or a next step or an adversary. It helped more than I expected. The first attempt at temptation came from Frank, and it was carefully constructed. He sent me a letter, a handwritten letter, not an email, which told me he had thought about this carefully. 3 pages in his cramped engineer's script on the good cream-colored stationery we kept in the desk drawer in the study. He wrote about the early years, about the trip we took to the Oregon coast for our 10th anniversary, the little rented cabin, the way the fog came in off the water in the mornings. He wrote about Daniel's first steps and Rachel's recitals and the summer we rebuilt the back deck together. He wrote that he knew he had caused an enormous harm. He did not name it, did not name Diane, and that he believed we could find a path through this if I was willing. I read the letter 3 times. I won't pretend it didn't affect me. 30 years of shared memory lives inside of you whether you choose it to or not. And some of those memories were real and good and entirely mine. The Oregon coast was real. Daniel's first steps were real. I held the letter, and I let myself feel the weight of all of it for exactly as long as I needed to. Then I put it in the manila envelope with the photographs and the financial records at Ruth's house. What was Frank offering, really? He was offering me the story of the past in exchange for dropping my claim on the future. He was inviting me to choose the comfort of familiar grief over the discomfort of uncertain freedom. I understood the logic. I understood the appeal. But I had been calculating things carefully for 2 months now, and the numbers didn't lie. He called twice that week. I let it go to voicemail. His messages were measured, non-threatening, almost gentle. The voice of a man who had decided that patience was his best strategy. I relayed the voicemails to Howard's office, as I had been instructed to do with all contact. Diane, for those few weeks, went quiet. No calls, no letters. I knew she was still in contact with Frank. Howard's office had informed me that Frank's attorney had listed Diane as a character witness in his counterfiling, which told me everything I needed to know about which way they had decided to lean. They were a unit now. They had made their choice, and in making it, they had given me a certain strange freedom. I no longer had to grieve the loss of my sister alongside the loss of my marriage. They had collapsed into one loss, which was awful, but also simpler. What surprised me in those weeks was the people who came forward. Ruth, of course. Steady, practical Ruth, who kept my envelope and made me tea and never once suggested I was overreacting. But also Margaret Hensley from the Piano Teachers Association, who called one afternoon and said quietly, "I heard something is happening with you and Frank. I won't pry, but I want you to know I've been through something like it, and if you want coffee some afternoon, I'm here." And my neighbor, Gloria, who began leaving containers of soup on my porch steps without a note. Just soup, warm, arriving every few days, as if she had decided that feeding me was the correct form of solidarity. And Daniel came every other weekend. Rachel called from Seattle every few days, asking careful questions about how I was eating and sleeping, which is how a child who loves you shows fear. I tried to be honest with her without alarming her. I told her I was managing. I told her I was not alone. I was not alone. That was the truth of those weeks. The fact I held on to when the evenings got very quiet and Biscuit put his head in my lap and the old house settled and creaked around me. Had I expected this? No. You spend a certain number of years believing that your central relationships, husband, sister, are your scaffolding, the structure that holds everything else up. You don't notice, until it fails, how many other connections you have built without quite meaning to. Ruth, Margaret Hensley, Gloria's soup, Daniel's every other weekend drives. These were the real structure. I had just never needed to lean on them before. In Howard's office on a Tuesday morning in December, surrounded by Frank's counterfilings and a stack of financial documents, I felt not happy, not victorious, not healed, but steady, like a building that had been tested by a storm and found to be still standing. Still standing, I thought, and straightened my papers. That is more than enough for now. They came on a Sunday, which was deliberate. Sunday was the day they knew I was most likely to be soft. Pot roast day. The day the house smelled like family, like a life that had meant something. I had stopped making pot roast since November, but they didn't know that. They still carried the map of me from before, the old Peggy, the one who set the table and asked no difficult questions and loved people at considerable cost to herself. Diane called first that Saturday evening, and her voice was different than it had been in our last conversation. Quieter, almost humble. Practiced, I now understood, but convincing enough that for a moment, just a moment, I felt the old pull of it. The pull of wanting her to be sincere. "Peggy," she said, "I think we've let this go too far. I think if we could just sit down together, the three of us, like adults, I really believe we can find a way through this that doesn't destroy everything." She used the word destroy, the same word Frank had used in my living room in November. They had spoken, I realized. They had rehearsed this together, probably over dinner in Columbus, at some table in some restaurant where no one knew them, working out each line. I said, "I'll let you know," and hung up. Then I called Howard and told him Frank and Diane had requested a meeting. Howard said flatly, "You are under no legal obligation to speak with either of them directly. I'd advise against it." I thanked him. I thought about it for the rest of the evening, walking through the dark house with Biscuit at my heels, the old floorboards creaking under my feet, the way they had for 27 years. And I decided I would let them come. Because by then I was steady enough to watch clearly, and I wanted to see exactly what they would do when they had one more opportunity and thought they had a chance. I wanted the confirmation. I wanted to see them without the story I had told myself about them for decades. They arrived at 2:00. Diane had brought flowers, supermarket tulips, slightly wilted, wrapped in green cellophane. which she handed to me at the door with a careful smile. Frank stood behind her, and he was wearing the blue sweater I had given him 2 Christmases ago, a choice that was not accidental. He knew I had chosen that sweater. He knew what it meant to me. He wore it like a key he thought might still fit a lock. I made coffee. I set out cups. I put a small plate of shortbread on the table because I had been raised to feed guests, and I found I could not quite abandon that, even now. I sat across from them at my own kitchen table, and I folded my hands, and I waited. It began as Diane had promised, conciliatory. Frank said he understood that he had hurt me. He said it with his eyes on the table, not on me, which told me the humility was managed rather than felt. He chose the table because looking at me directly would have required him to sustain something he did not actually feel. Diane said she knew she had violated trust and that she was deeply sorry. The word sorry came out smooth and practiced, like something she had said to a mirror that morning. But then, gradually, the conversation shifted. The warmth thinned. The structure underneath became visible. Frank mentioned the house. He mentioned the disruption to the neighborhood. What people would say, the difficulty of selling, the cost of 2 separate households running simultaneously. He mentioned Rachel's distress, which was real, and which he was deliberately using as a lever, knowing it was the place I was softest. He mentioned that at my age, he said, as if age were a room with a low ceiling, starting over was an enormous undertaking and perhaps not the wisest course for a woman in my position. At my age, at my position, I looked at him across my kitchen table, at this man I had made 30 years of Sunday dinners for, and I thought, there it is. There is the actual argument. Everything before this was packaging. Then Diane leaned forward and said the thing she had been building toward, I now understood, since she had arrived with her wilted tulips and her careful smile. She said that if I continued with the divorce proceedings, Frank's attorney would be compelled to raise questions about my mental state. The words came out slowly, like something fragile she was placing on the table between us. She said she didn't want that to happen. She said it would be very painful for the children. She said she was telling me this as my sister, out of love, because she didn't want to see me hurt. Was that a threat? Wrapped in concern, dressed in apology, served with supermarket tulips and shortbread on my own good plates? But yes, that was a threat. That was the clearest threat I had ever received, and it was coming from the mouth of a woman who had shared my childhood bedroom. I looked at her for a long moment. My little sister. The girl I had walked to school. The woman I had lent money and given guest rooms and worried over in the small hours of dozens of nights across 40 years. I let myself see her, really see her, without the filter of memory or obligation or hope. Diane, I said, and my voice was entirely level, I want you to hear me clearly. I have, in the possession of my attorney, time-stamped photographs taken across several weeks, a full accounting of marital assets and any alterations to those assets, and a formal report from a licensed private investigator whose testimony is admissible in an Ohio court. I also have voicemails saved and transcribed, and a handwritten letter from Frank in which he acknowledges causing enormous harm. His words, not mine, written on his own stationery in his own hand. I picked up my coffee cup and took a calm, unhurried sip. If Frank's attorney would like to raise questions about my mental state, I look forward to that conversation very much. Frank's jaw tightened. A small, controlled movement, but I saw it. Diane's face went through several expressions. Surprise, recalculation, something that briefly resembled genuine shame. before settling on something blank and hard. They left 15 minutes later. The tulips sat in the center of the table in their grocery store wrapping, still in the cellophane, forgotten. I put them in a vase anyway, trimmed the stems, added water. They were not the flowers' fault. They lasted 4 more days, and I looked at them each morning and found, each time, that I felt nothing complicated about them at all. After they left, I stood alone in my kitchen, and I felt it. The small, cold tremor of fear that moved through me from my sternum down. They were not finished. I knew that. People who make threats dressed as concern do not simply accept a polite refusal and retreat permanently. They regroup. They look for another angle. But underneath the fear was something else that surprised me with its clarity. A clean, quiet anger that had nothing of hysteria or desperation in it. It was the anger of a person who has been underestimated one too many times by people who had every opportunity to know better. They had come to my house, sat at my table, eaten my shortbread, and tried to dismantle my resolve. They had looked at me and seen a woman they thought they could still move. They had been wrong about that for years. They were still wrong, and now I knew exactly what they were willing to do, the full extent of it, the specific shape of it, which meant I was considerably better prepared than I had been 2 hours ago. I called Howard first thing Monday morning, before my first piano student arrived. They made an implicit threat about challenging my competency, I told him. In my kitchen, Sunday afternoon, both of them present. Howard was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "Did they say that in front of any witnesses?" "No," I said, "just me." "Then we document it in writing today. Your account, dated and signed," he said. "And we accelerate the timeline. I want this in front of the mediator before they have time to regroup." "Good," I said. I hung up. My 9 o'clock student knocked at the front door. I smoothed my hair, walked down the hall, and opened it with a smile. Good, I thought again, underneath the smile. We accelerate. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February at a law office in the county seat. A glass and brick building on 4th Street that always seemed too bright inside, too much fluorescent light for the conversations that must have taken place there. Howard and I arrived early, as Howard always insisted. We sat in the conference room, a long table, neutral-colored chairs, a window looking out onto a bare parking lot. And he went over, one more time, what we had. I already knew it by heart. But Howard was the kind of attorney who believed in saying things out loud until they felt inevitable. Frank arrived with his attorney, a man named Gary Strand, who dressed very well and spoke in a tone that implied he found most situations faintly beneath him. Diane was not present. She was a witness, not a party. But her absence felt present in the room in its own way. The mediator was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Oakes, silver-haired and unreadable, who had clearly sat in rooms like this one far too many times to be impressed by anyone's grievances. She opened the session, explained the process, and asked both parties to begin. Gary Strand went first. He presented Frank's position: a long marriage of mutual contribution, a wife who had, in recent months, taken unilateral financial actions, constituting a breach of marital trust, a situation that called for equitable and measured resolution. He was smooth. He made everything sound like a business dispute between parties of equal wrongdoing. He did not mention Diane. Howard let him finish. Then Howard opened his folder. He began with the private investigator's report, Carl Reese's full written account, the 11 photographs attached as exhibits, each time-stamped, each clearly depicting Frank Collins in the company of Diane, identified by her full name, Diane Patricia Weston, the petitioner's biological sister, across a period of 8 weeks in multiple Columbus locations. Frank across the table went very still, Howard then presented the financial records, a complete accounting of marital assets as of the filing date, documentation showing no unilateral removal or concealment of funds by his client, and a comparison demonstrating that the personal account I had opened predated the marriage and had been established with inheritance funds traceable to my mother's estate. Strand's smooth expression tightened just slightly. Then Howard presented Frank's handwritten letter. He did not read it aloud in its entirety. He read 2 sentences, the part in which Frank acknowledged an enormous harm that I alone am responsible for. He read it once, clearly, and let it sit. Patricia Oakes made a note. "I'd like to address the suggestion," Howard continued, looking not at Strand, but at Oakes, "that my client's mental state is a relevant consideration in these proceedings. I have here a letter from Dr. Susan Marsh, Margaret Collins's physician of 14 years, attesting to her full cognitive and emotional competency. I also have a written summary prepared by my client herself, detailing the specific meeting of January 19th at her residence, during which this suggestion was first raised and the exact language used." Strand looked at Frank. Frank looked at the table. "My client," Howard said, "has been conducting herself throughout this process with extraordinary composure and scrupulous legality. The same cannot be said of the opposing party." I had been watching Frank's face across the width of that conference table, and I watched what happened to it over the course of that hour, the way you watch weather change over a flat landscape. The gradual loss of the controlled expression, the tightening around the eyes, the small muscle at the jaw that worked and worked. He was an engineer. He had built his defense carefully, but Howard had arrived with the actual foundations, and there was nowhere left to build from. Toward the end of the session, Strand requested a brief recess. He and Frank stepped into the hallway. Howard and I sat in the conference room without speaking. Outside the window, a woman crossed the parking lot in a gray coat, her head down against the wind, not knowing she was passing a window behind which a marriage of 30 years was being finally, officially taken apart. "You're doing very well," Howard said quietly. "I know," I said. When Frank and Strand returned, there was something different about Frank's posture, a slight slackening, the architecture of a man who has recalculated and found that the numbers no longer work in his favor. Strand began to speak about revised terms, about Frank's willingness to accept a more generous asset division in the interest of resolution. I looked at Frank. He did not look at me. Is this what 30 years comes to, I wondered? Not a reconciliation, not even a real reckoning, just a man doing the math and adjusting accordingly? Yes, I thought, sometimes that is exactly what it comes to. And sometimes that is enough. The settlement took 6 more weeks to finalize. Howard had warned me it would feel anticlimactic. Not a single dramatic moment, but a steady accumulation of signed documents arriving in envelopes, each one closing off another door with a quiet and permanent click. Legal resolution, he explained, does not look like a verdict in a film. It looks like paperwork. It smells like paper and ink and the particular staleness of law office air. He was right, and he was also wrong. Each document felt to me like an exhale I had been holding since October. Each signature was a small, definitive act of reclamation. The house on Birchwood Lane was awarded to me outright. This had been Howard's central objective from the beginning, and he had built the case for it methodically. The documented marital fault, the sustained pattern of deception, the financial harm caused by Frank's use of marital funds to support the relationship, and the implicit threat made in my kitchen in January. All of it documented, all of it submitted, all of it considered. Ohio law does not require fault to grant a divorce, but it permits courts to weigh fault when dividing marital property, and the record that Howard had assembled was thorough enough that Strand had no realistic basis for contesting it. Frank had wanted the house sold and the proceeds split equally. He did not get that. He got his workshop tools and certain items of personal property that he had requested, and he signed the paperwork transferring his interest in the property over to me on a Wednesday afternoon in March, in a small room in Howard's office building, with a pen that I noticed had run slightly low on ink by the time it was his turn to sign. I noticed this the way you notice small, irrelevant things when larger things are being settled around you. I also received 32% of Frank's county pension, the portion calculated from the years of our marriage during which that pension had accrued as provided under Ohio law. Howard had worked this figure carefully, consulting a financial analyst to ensure the calculation was precise and defensible. It was not a small amount. Distributed over the years I could expect to receive it, it was significant. Significant enough that when Howard slid the final pension division document across his desk for my signature, he permitted himself a brief, tight smile, which was the most demonstrative I had ever seen him in our months of working together. I signed it with a steady hand. The joint savings account division was completed with one notable addition. Frank's own bank records, subpoenaed as part of the asset discovery process, revealed a wire transfer made approximately 2 years prior to a personal account belonging to Diane Patricia Weston. $3,200 transferred without my knowledge or consent from our joint marital account during the same period when Frank had told me the money lent to Diane had come from his personal discretionary funds. It had not. It had come from us. From me, as much as from him, and he had transferred it to her without telling me, which constituted a documented misuse of marital assets. Howard had found it buried in 18 months of bank statements. He had flagged it with a single yellow sticky note, and the word here, written in his precise handwriting, and I had looked at that yellow square and felt the specific, clarifying anger of a person who discovers that the deception went further than they had known. The full amount, with calculated interest, was returned to me in the settlement. Howard calculated it to the cent. I appreciated that enormously. Precision, in my experience, is its own form of respect. Frank's counterclaims dissolved entirely. The challenge to my mental competency, which Strand had introduced as a strategic pressure tactic and had presumably always known he could not sustain, was formally withdrawn before the final hearing. The allegation of unilateral financial misconduct regarding my personal account was withdrawn alongside it. Once Howard submitted the documentation tracing those funds to my mother's estate in an unbroken chain going back 14 years. There was nothing left in either claim, and Strand was too experienced an attorney to waste the court's time or his remaining credibility pressing arguments that had no ground under them. I did not attend the final hearing myself. Howard represented me, as he had throughout. He called me afterward from the courthouse steps, and I could hear the particular ambient sounds of a public building. Footsteps, a distant voice, the hollow resonance of a vaulted ceiling, behind his measured voice. "It's done," he said. "All of it?" I said. "Everything we discussed, every item." A brief pause. "Congratulations, Peggy." I was standing in my kitchen when he said it. My kitchen, definitively and completely mine now, with my name on the deed and no other. And I was looking out the window at the back garden, still bare and gray in early March. The raised tomato bed, not yet planted, the south fence waiting for its impatience. But I could see it the way it would look in June, the way I had always wanted it to look, and the fact that I would be the one to make it look that way, and the only one, was not a diminishment. It was an opening. I thanked Howard. He said I had been an excellent client, organized, patient, and remarkably clear-headed throughout a genuinely difficult process. I thanked him for that too. I made tea, and I sat at the kitchen table with Biscuit's chin resting on my knee and the afternoon light moving slowly across the linoleum floor the way it had done for 27 years, and I let the room be mine. Fully, quietly, irrevocably mine. As for Diane, the divorce decree did not touch her directly. She was not a named party. She had volunteered herself as a character witness for Frank and had prepared to testify. Strand had quietly advised Frank not to call her once the mediation outcome became clear, understanding that putting her on the stand would only invite further testimony about the nature and duration of their relationship. She had sat in a courthouse waiting area for over 3 hours on the day of the final hearing and had then gone home without speaking to anyone. I learned this from Daniel, who had heard it secondhand from Frank in a brief, painful phone call. Daniel relayed it to me carefully, watching my face for my reaction. My reaction was very small, smaller than I expected. She called me once after the settlement was final, on a Tuesday evening in late March. I was in the garden, turning the soil in the new raised bed, and I felt my phone vibrate in my jacket pocket. I looked at the screen. I looked at her name. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept digging. She did not leave a message. I did not call back. Not that evening. Not in the days that followed. Not in the weeks that accumulated into a silence that gradually became its own kind of answer. This was not a decision I made dramatically. It was a decision I arrived at the way you arrive at certain truths, gradually and then all at once, and with a quiet that feels less like an ending than like finally setting down something very heavy that you carried for so long you had stopped noticing the weight. There are losses that are done to you, and there are losses you have to choose. Diane was the second kind. I chose it with open eyes, and I do not regret it. And on the days when I miss her, the girl she was, the Saturday morning calls, the particular way she laughed at things, I allow myself to feel it, and then I go back to whatever I was doing. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about grief. You do not leave it behind. You simply learn to carry it in a way that leaves your hands free. Frank moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus in April. He took his workshop tools, his engineering books, the television from the study, and the coffee table his mother had given us, which I had never liked anyway. He left behind the blue curtains in the kitchen, 3 boxes of miscellaneous items he apparently decided were not worth retrieving, and 27 years of wear on the floors and walls and door frames of a house that was now entirely, legally, and permanently someone else's. Mine. On the last Saturday of March, the day after Howard's call, I drove to the garden center on Route 9, the one with the good soil and the knowledgeable staff, and I bought 6 flats of impatiens, a heritage tomato starter set with 6 varieties, and a new trowel. My old one was worn at the handle. I had been meaning to replace it for 2 years. I put the new one in my cart without deliberating, without asking whether it was a reasonable purchase or the right time or what anyone else would think. I bought the trowel. I drove home. I put it in the garden shed next to the impatiens, ready for spring. That was enough for one day. Spring came, and with it, the particular Ohio light that makes everything look freshly washed, clear and angled, turning even an ordinary backyard into something worth looking at. I planted impatiens along the south fence and started a raised bed for tomatoes where Frank's old workshop had stood. 6 varieties. I had always wanted to do that and had never done it while Frank was here. That was the thing I kept noticing those first months. The sheer number of small things I had been quietly not choosing without ever registering it as a pattern. No cat, because Frank was indifferent to cats. No dark green bedroom because Frank preferred beige. No watercolor class because Tuesday evenings were when Frank liked the television quiet. Small things. Individually, nothing. In aggregate, an entire set of unchosen choices. In April, I got a cat, Vera, a gray tabby of formidable personality who immediately established dominion over Biscuit. In May, I painted the bedroom dark green. In June, I started the watercolor class and found genuine pleasure in it, which is better than talent anyway. Daniel came for Memorial Day. Rachel flew in from Seattle for 2 weeks in July. The house was noisy and full and wonderful in the way that only happens when your grown children come home. Frank, I heard through Daniel, was not flourishing. The Columbus apartment was expensive on a single income. The pension, reduced by the settlement, required adjustments he hadn't anticipated. Old mutual friends drifted away, as they tend to do. Diane's arrangement with Frank had not resolved into anything stable. She had her rental, her diminished income, and the loss of the one relationship that had been her safety net for most of her adult life. I thought about calling her sometimes. We had shared a childhood no one else could remember the way we could. But she had made her choices knowing I was in the next room, calling every Saturday, loving her. She made them anyway. You carry that, but you don't let it undo the rest. By October, I had finished my first watercolor, the South Garden fence, the impatiens going ragged at season's end, the late afternoon light. I framed it and hung it in the dark green bedroom, where it looked like it had always belonged. I turned 69 in November. Ruth, Gloria, Rachel, Daniel, a few piano families. Gloria's 7-layer chocolate cake. Vera knocked a glass of lemonade off the counter and appeared entirely unrepentant. I looked around my kitchen at the people who had come, and I thought, this is what remained when everything false was removed. Not nothing, not close to nothing. So that is my story. A woman of 68 who discovered she had been living inside someone else's arrangement and chose, quietly and methodically, to dismantle it. I was told I was too old, too trusting, too far in to change anything. I changed everything anyway. What did I learn? That silence is not weakness, that waiting is not accepting, that the life truly yours, down to the green walls and the gray cat and the tomatoes in the raised bed, is available to you at any age. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reached you, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. My children took me to court to take my home and put me in a nursing home. My son's lawyer smirked. She has no chance. But I said 3 words. The judge dropped his papers and, good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I have lived in the same house on Elm Creek Road for 51 years. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because the house is not just a house. Harold and I built it, not with a contractor, not with hired hands, but with our own savings, our own weekends, our own blistered palms. We planted the oak tree in the backyard the summer Daniel was born. We painted the kitchen yellow the year Linda came home from the hospital. Every scratch on the doorframe was a child's height recorded in pencil. Every creak in the 3rd stair was the sound of a family growing up. Harold passed in 2019. Prostate cancer. He went quietly in the bedroom we shared for 43 years, with my hand in his and the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. I grieved. I grieved deeply. the way you grieve when someone has been the other half of your breathing for so long that you aren't sure which thoughts were yours to begin with. But I did not fall apart. I am 74 years old. I have buried a husband, a mother, a best friend, and a dog I loved more than some people I've met. I know how to carry weight. After Harold died, I settled into a quieter life. I tended the garden. I had my book club on Thursdays. Ruth, Connie, Beverly, and I had been meeting since 1998. I drove myself to the grocery store. I cooked proper meals. I was not frail. I was not confused. I was a woman living alone in her own home, which is a perfectly ordinary thing to be at 74. Daniel called more often after the funeral. That should have been my first sign. My son is 51 years old. He works in commercial real estate in Phoenix, which is a 4-hour drive from my house in Tucson. He has a wife named Cheryl, who has always looked at my furniture like she's pricing it, and 2 teenage sons who I love, despite the fact that they cannot hold a conversation longer than 30 seconds without checking their phones. Daniel was always the practical one. Harold's word for it was practical, though I sometimes thought calculating was closer to the truth. He could look at any situation and find the angle that served him best. I used to admire that. I used to think it was intelligence. Linda is 47. She lives 20 minutes from me, which means I saw her far more than I saw Daniel, though I'm not sure that translated into closeness. Linda is soft-spoken in public and sharp-tongued at home. I'd watched that pattern her whole life. She married a man named Greg, who lost his accounting job in 2021 and had not, as far as I could tell, replaced it. They had 3 kids and a mortgage, and a lifestyle that I suspected cost more than it should. The calls from Daniel started in late 2022. Friendly at first, checking in, asking how I was feeling, whether I'd been to the doctor, whether I'd had any trouble with the stairs. I answered honestly. I was fine. Yes, I'd had my checkup. No, the stairs were not a problem. Then he started visiting. 3 weekends in 6 months, which was more than he'd visited in the previous 2 years combined. He brought Cheryl. They walked through the house with their eyes moving in ways that made me feel like I was already gone. Linda, meanwhile, began stopping by unannounced. She'd find small things to worry about. A dish left in the sink, a bill on the counter she deemed unpaid. It was paid, I'd simply not filed it yet. Once a single burned-out light bulb in the hallway that she photographed with her phone before I could change it. I noticed the photographs. I didn't say anything. I filed the observation away in the back of my mind the way you file things you hope you'll never need. The first real moment, the one I kept returning to later, the one that should have made me act sooner, happened on a Sunday afternoon in March of 2023. Daniel and Linda were both at the house, which was unusual. They said they'd coordinated the visit to surprise me. We had lunch. We talked about the grandchildren. And then, over coffee, Daniel set a manila folder on the kitchen table. "Mom," he said, "we've been talking, and we think it might be time to consider some options." Inside the folder was a brochure for a senior living facility called Sunrise Pines. Private rooms, organized activities, memory support services, which is a phrase designed to make you feel that needing it is inevitable rather than exceptional. I looked at the brochure. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter, who was examining her coffee cup. "I'm not moving," I said. Daniel smiled. The patient, measured smile of someone who believes the conversation is already decided. "Nobody's saying you have to do anything right now. We're just starting a conversation." But I knew sitting in my own kitchen at my own table in the house Harold and I had built with our own hands, that this was not the beginning of a conversation. It was the beginning of a plan, and I had not yet begun to make mine. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bedroom Harold and I had shared, and I stared at the ceiling, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened at that kitchen table. Not the shock of it. I am too old for shock. But the grief of it. The particular grief that comes when you realize that people you loved, people you raised, have been calculating behind your back. I thought about the brochure. Sunrise Pines. I had looked it up before bed. It was 45 minutes away in a suburb I'd never had reason to visit. The rooms were small. The reviews were middling. The monthly cost was $4,200, which, if you were a person who had just looked up how much a house on Elm Creek Road was worth in the current Tucson market, and I had, also before bed, told a very clear story about who would benefit from the arithmetic. My house had been appraised the previous year for $410,000. Harold and I had paid it off in 2001. There was no mortgage. There was no lien. The house was mine, free and clear, and had been for 22 years, $410,000. Divided by 2. I lay there in the dark, and I did the math my children had already done, and I felt something shift inside me. Not collapse, not despair. Something harder than that, and colder, and more useful. Fear came first, though. I won't pretend otherwise. I was a 74-year-old widow living alone, and my children had lawyers. I was certain of that because Daniel does not make moves without lawyers. And I had spent 51 years being a mother and a wife and a gardener and a reader of books, not a litigant. The legal system was not my native country. But then I thought about Harold. Harold was a quiet man, but he was not a passive one. He used to say, "The person who prepares wins more arguments than the person who is right." He'd said it about business negotiations, about difficult neighbors, about the time our insurance company tried to underpay a roof claim, and he'd spent 6 weeks documenting every conversation until they capitulated. Preparation. Documentation. That was Harold's language. I got up at 5:30 in the morning and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had laid down that folder, and I opened a notebook. I wrote down everything I could remember from the previous 6 months. Every visit. Every question about my health. Every photograph Linda had taken. The dates, as precisely as I could recall them. The exact words Daniel had used. We've been talking. We think it might be time. Starting a conversation. The way Cheryl had walked through the living room with her eyes moving over the furniture. Then I wrote down what I knew about myself. I was in good health. My doctor, Patricia Huang, at the Rincon Medical Group, had cleared me at my annual physical 8 months ago. Blood pressure normal, cognition sharp, no balance issues, no fall history. I drove, I cooked, I managed my own finances. I had not, in recent memory, left the stove on or missed a bill or gotten lost in a place I knew. I had a will, drawn up in 2020, which left the house to Daniel and Linda in equal shares upon my death. That was no longer a document I felt comfortable leaving unexamined. I called my book club friend Connie that morning. Connie Abernethy had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired, and she had the kind of practical legal knowledge that is more useful than theory. I told her what had happened. There was a long pause on her end. "Margaret," she said, "you need a real estate attorney and an elder law attorney, and you need them before your kids make their next move." "I know," I said, "and you need to protect that deed." I didn't know exactly what she meant by that yet, but I wrote it down. That afternoon, I drove to the public library. I still preferred to research in quiet spaces, away from the house where I was increasingly aware that my children might have keys. And I spent 3 hours reading about guardianship proceedings, conservatorship, and what in the state of Arizona constituted grounds for challenging a senior's right to independent living. What I found was sobering and clarifying in equal measure. To remove a person's legal autonomy in Arizona, a petitioner must demonstrate that the person is incapacitated, unable to manage their own affairs due to a mental or physical condition. The standard requires medical evidence. It requires a court appointment. It is not, in theory, easy to obtain without genuine cause. In theory, but I also read the case studies. I read about families who had coached physicians, hired compliant evaluators, and presented selectively edited evidence to overworked probate judges. I read about elderly people who had walked into courtrooms independent and walked out legally stripped of their own decisions. I closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the library's quiet. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh page and I wrote at the top, my plan. It was going to take time. It was going to take money. It was going to require me to be patient and precise and absolutely, relentlessly prepared. I was 74 years old, and I had been underestimated my entire life. I was about to stop allowing it. The first call I made was to an attorney named Robert Castillo. Connie had given me his name. She'd worked with him years ago on an estate case and described him as thorough, unhurried, and not given to false reassurance, which was exactly what I needed. His office was on the east side of Tucson, in a low building surrounded by mesquite trees, the kind of place that didn't advertise on billboards. I liked that. I told him everything. The folder on the table, the unannounced visits, the photographs, the brochure, the conversations about my health that had never once asked how I felt, only whether I was capable. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and then he asked me very specific questions. Did I have a copy of my current will? Was the deed to the property solely in my name? Had I signed any documents for my children, powers of attorney, healthcare proxies, anything at all, in the past 3 years? I had signed nothing. He nodded slowly. That's good. That's actually your first line of defense. They have no current legal authority over you or your affairs. Can they get it? They can try to petition the court for guardianship or conservatorship. That's what this is building toward, in my assessment. They'd need to demonstrate incapacity. He paused. Have you had a recent medical evaluation? I had. I told him about Dr. Huang. He asked me to request a copy of the records from that visit, specifically the cognitive screening results. He also recommended I schedule a new evaluation, comprehensive, including neuropsychological testing, with a specialist he trusted, so that I had an independent, current, and thorough document of my mental and physical capacity. Not because there was anything wrong with me, he said, but because in a courtroom, documentation beats testimony every time. I left his office with a list of 4 action items and a retainer agreement. I wrote a check without hesitation. This was not the time to weigh costs. The neuropsychological evaluation was scheduled for the following week at a clinic near the university. I drove myself there and spent 2.5 hours being tested on memory, attention, reasoning, processing speed, and executive function. The psychologist, a calm woman named Dr. Reyes, told me at the end of the session that my scores placed me in the above-average range for my age group across all domains. I thanked her. I asked for the report in writing as soon as possible. It was during this same week that I noticed the first sign that Daniel and Linda were paying attention. Linda called on a Tuesday evening. Nothing unusual in that. But the questions were different. She asked if I'd talked to anyone about the conversation we'd had at the house. She asked it casually, the way you ask something when you're hoping the answer is no. I told her I'd spoken with Connie, which was true, and mentioned nothing about Robert Castillo. There was a pause. Connie Abernethy? Why? She's my friend, I said. I talked to her. Another pause. Mom, we're just trying to help. We don't want this to become adversarial. The word adversarial told me everything. You don't use that word unless you've already been thinking in legal terms. The second sign came 3 days later, when I discovered that Linda had spoken to my neighbor, Patricia Walsh, asking whether she'd noticed anything concerning about my behavior recently. Patricia told me this herself, standing at my back fence with a look of uncomfortable apology on her face. She said Linda had implied she was asking on behalf of the family and had asked specifically about whether I'd left the garage door open overnight, whether I seemed forgetful, whether I'd had any visitors she didn't recognize. Patricia had told Linda she had no concerns. She told me she thought the whole thing was odd. I thanked her and went inside and sat down at my kitchen table and wrote it all in my notebook. Date, time, what was said, who witnessed it. The systematic questioning of my neighbors was not the behavior of people having a casual conversation. It was the behavior of people building a record. The third, and most important, sign came at the end of that week. I had requested a copy of the deed to the house from the Pima County Recorder's Office, simply to have it in hand and to verify its current status. The clerk's office sent me a printout showing the current title history. Everything was in order. The deed was in my name alone, as it had been since Harold's death, when it transferred to me under the right of survivorship we had established decades ago. But there was also a notation I did not recognize. A title search had been run on the property 6 weeks earlier. Not by me. Not by any bank or lender I recognized. By a law firm in Phoenix, Hartwell and Briggs, LLP. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I called Robert Castillo. That's Daniel's attorney, I said, reading him the firm name. Yes, he said. It is. A brief pause. Margaret, they've already started. I already knew that. But hearing it said plainly by a man whose job it was to know what things meant made it real in a different way. This was no longer a conversation about a brochure on a kitchen table. This was a lawsuit in the making, and I had just found the first piece of evidence that proved it. Robert Castillo moved quickly after the title search discovery. Within 10 days, he had filed a quiet title action on my behalf. A legal proceeding that formally established the property as solely mine and put any future claim to it on record with the court. He also drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Hartwell and Briggs, informing them that I was legally represented, that any further attempts to investigate or encumber my property without my consent would be challenged, and that I was documenting all contact. He sent a copy to Daniel. I would like to tell you that I felt triumphant when he told me this. What I actually felt was tired and then resolved, and then something close to sad. The specific sadness of a person who hoped, even at this late stage, that she had misread the situation, that the title search had an innocent explanation, that her son would call and say there had been a misunderstanding. Daniel called on a Thursday evening. It was not the call I had hoped for. You hired a lawyer. His voice was controlled. He was not shouting, which was more unnerving than if he had been. Without telling us, without even giving us a chance to explain. Explain what, Daniel? The title search was just research. We were looking into options for estate planning, for after... He stopped. For after I die? For after you're no longer able to manage things independently, which is going to happen, Mom. That's just reality. It hasn't happened yet, I said, and until it does, my house is my house. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to hear him breathing. Then, you're making this very difficult. I said nothing. We're your family. We're trying to protect you. From what? I asked. From living in my own home? He hung up. Linda came to the house 2 days later. She did not knock. She had a key which I had given her years ago for emergencies, and which I had not yet thought to change. And I heard the front door open while I was in the kitchen. She came in and sat down across from me, and for a moment she simply looked at me the way you look at a problem you're calculating. "Daniel is very upset," she said. "I imagine he is. Mom, do you understand what you're doing? You filed legal papers against your own family. Do you know how that looks?" "I know exactly how it looks," I said. "It looks like a woman protecting her home." Linda's composure cracked slightly. Not much, but enough. "We have documentation, you know. We've been keeping records. You left the stove on in February. You forgot Ruth's birthday. You told me the same story about your doctor's appointment 3 times in 1 week." I set down my coffee cup. "I left a burner on low while I went to the back garden for 10 minutes. Ruth's birthday is in March, and I sent her a card on the 5th. And yes, I told you about the appointment more than once because you seemed distracted and I wasn't sure you'd heard me." She blinked. "I have been keeping records too," I said quietly, "since March of last year." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Linda stood up. "You're going to regret this. Daniel has resources. He has a very good attorney, and he knows how to—" She stopped herself. "How to what?" I asked. She left without answering. That night, Daniel called again, and this time his voice was different, tighter, and with an undertone of something I recognized from his adolescence, the particular register he used when he knew he was losing an argument, but hadn't accepted it yet. "We've consulted with our attorney," he said. "We're filing a petition for guardianship. Voluntary or not, this is happening. And if you fight it, it's going to be expensive and public, and you're going to end up looking unstable in front of a judge." I let him finish. "I have a neuropsychological evaluation completed last week, showing full cognitive capacity," I said. "I have a primary care physician who will testify to my physical health. I have documented every interaction we've had for the past year, including this phone call, which I should mention I began recording when you started speaking." Another silence. "Good night, Daniel," I said, and I hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The house was quiet. The oak tree in the backyard moved slowly in the evening wind. I thought about Harold, the way I often did when things were difficult. Not with longing, exactly, but with a kind of consultation, as if I could still ask him whether I was handling this right. I thought he'd say I was. I took 3 days after that. I put the notebook in the drawer. I went to book club. I had dinner with Connie and Ruth, and we did not discuss the case at all. I let myself sit in the garden in the late afternoon warmth and watch the birds at the feeder Harold had installed the year before he got sick. I was going to need my strength for what came next, and I intended to have it. The offer came on a Monday. Daniel called. Not in the evening this time, but mid-morning, which felt calculated, as if he expected me to be more receptive in daylight, less guarded. His tone had changed again. It was warmer now, conciliatory. The voice of a man who had decided, on advice of counsel or by his own instinct, that confrontation had not worked, and charm was the next instrument to try. "Mom," he said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I think we went about this the wrong way. Cheryl and I talked it over, and we were too heavy-handed. We scared you instead of including you. That was wrong." A pause, perfectly timed. "What we want is for you to be happy and safe. That's all we've ever wanted." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "We'd like to put a proposal on the table, something that works for everyone." He explained it carefully, in the organized way he explained things when he had rehearsed them. The proposal was this: I would sell the house voluntarily and use the proceeds to fund my own care at a facility of my choosing. Any amount left over, if there was any after care costs, which he was careful to note could be substantial, would be preserved in a trust for my benefit. The house would be sold. The money would go into a structure controlled by others. I would live somewhere chosen for me. It was dressed up differently than the original plan, but it was the same plan. "I'll think about it," I said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. There's no rush." There was a rush, and we both knew it, but I let the sentence sit there. After I hung up, I called Robert Castillo and told him about the offer. He was unsurprised. "This is what they do when the legal path looks uncertain," he said. "They try to get you to agree voluntarily to what they couldn't force. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything in writing or verbally." "I know," I said. "Do you want me to respond formally on your behalf?" "Not yet," I said. "I want to watch a little longer." What I want to tell you about that period, those quiet weeks in the spring, is that I was not suffering. I know that might be surprising. I was in a legal dispute with my children. I was navigating paperwork and attorney calls and the low hum of anxiety that comes with contested proceedings, and yet I was not, fundamentally, unhappy. The house was still mine. The garden was coming in well. The hummingbirds had found the new feeder I'd put up near the patio. And I was, for the first time in years, not lonely. The case had done something unexpected. It had brought people toward me. Connie had become my daily phone call. And in those conversations, I was reminded of why we had been friends for 25 years. Her frankness, her humor, the way she never softened things that didn't need softening. Ruth had quietly, without being asked, begun keeping notes of our Thursday meetings, recording who was present and what was discussed, because she understood, with the instinct of a former schoolteacher, that documentation of my engagement and lucidity was useful. Beverly had offered her guest room if I ever felt I needed to be somewhere other than the house for a night. I had also, unexpectedly, acquired an ally at the county recorder's office, a clerk named Thomas, who had processed my quiet title paperwork and, recognizing what it was, had mentioned that this type of filing had become more common in recent years and that there were advocacy resources available. He'd handed me a card for an organization called the Arizona Elder Rights Project, which provided legal and social support for older adults facing exactly this kind of family-based pressure. I called them the following Tuesday. The advocate I spoke with was a woman named Sandra Flores, 40-something, direct, with the cadence of someone who had heard many versions of this story. She listened to mine. She told me I had done nearly everything right, and that the one gap was a formal supportive network on record. Not just an attorney, but documentation of my social engagement, my community, my ongoing activities, that would demonstrate to any judge that I was a participant in the world, not an isolated elder in decline. We built a list together. Book club attendance. Ruth's notes would cover that. Regular attendance at First Lutheran, where I had been a member since 1987. The church secretary confirmed she could provide a letter. My library card history, which showed consistent borrowing. My volunteer work at the literacy program at the branch library, 2 hours every Wednesday, which the program coordinator was glad to document. I was not invisible. I was not diminished. I was not a woman waiting to be managed. I was a woman with a life, and I was going to prove it. They came together on a Saturday in April. I saw Daniel's rental car. He always rented in Tucson, a habit from business travel that he'd never dropped. Pull into the driveway at 11 in the morning. Linda's Subaru was right behind it. They had coordinated, which meant this visit was not spontaneous, which meant it had been planned, which meant it had a purpose that had nothing to do with coffee and conversation. I let them in. I was not going to hide in my own home. Cheryl had not come, which was notable. This was a family conversation, stripped to the principles. Daniel looked tired. The composed efficiency that usually defined him was slightly worn, like a suit that had been slept in. Linda had brought a casserole dish, which she carried with both hands as if the offering of food could soften what was coming. We sat in the living room. I served coffee. We talked about the grandchildren for 12 minutes, which I know because I was watching the clock on the mantel, and which felt like a runway, not a conversation. Daniel asked about the oldest boy's baseball season. Linda mentioned that her middle child had started piano lessons. I answered each question with genuine warmth, because whatever had passed between us legally, those were still my grandchildren, and I still loved them without reservation. But I kept one part of my attention on the room, on the pacing, on the fact that neither of them had driven hours or across town for small talk. Then Daniel set down his cup. "We want to start over," he said. He explained at length what a new beginning might look like. He had a way of describing things that made them sound reasonable and warm, while the structure underneath remained entirely unchanged. The new version of the plan involved me staying in the house temporarily, 6 months, perhaps a year, while we worked together to plan the transition. He would visit more. Linda would help with maintenance. We would tour facilities together as a family so I could feel involved in the decision. "And the legal proceedings?" I asked. "We'd drop them, all of it. A clean slate." He said it easily, as if this were the generous offer, not the removal of a threat he had created. Linda leaned forward. "Mom, think about what you're putting us through. We're your children. We love you. Doesn't that matter?" And there it was, the card that was always going to be played. Love as the argument for surrender. Family as the reason I should let go of the thing that was mine. I looked at my daughter. At the casserole she'd brought. At the careful distress on her face. At the effort she was making to look like a daughter rather than a petitioner. And I thought about all the years I had believed that her sharpness was a shell, and her softness was the truth. I was no longer certain which was which. "It matters very much," I said, "which is why I'm not going to pretend this conversation is about love." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You ran a title search on my property," I said. "You hired attorneys before you sat down at that table with a brochure. You questioned my neighbors. You compiled a list of my supposed failures to use as legal evidence." I paused. "That's not what love looks like. That's what a case being built looks like." Linda's eyes filled with tears. Genuine or performed, I couldn't fully say, and I found that I had stopped trying to parse the difference. "We were scared," she said. "We didn't handle it right. We got ahead of ourselves." "Maybe," I said. "But you're still here today, asking me to agree to a timeline for leaving my home. The framing is kinder. The destination is the same." Daniel shifted in his chair. He tried a different approach then, the appeal to practicality, which was always his strongest instrument. He talked about maintenance costs, about the roof that would need replacing in a few years, about the yard and whether I could realistically manage it alone. Every sentence was constructed to sound like concern and land like doubt. He was planting seeds, one by one, into the conversation, hoping something would take root. I listened. I did not interrupt. I let each sentence finish. And then I said, "I have a contractor I trust for the roof. I have a yard service I can hire for the heavy work. I have a savings account that can cover both." I folded my hands. I have thought about all of this. I have lived here for 51 years. Did either of you imagine I hadn't thought about it? What? The room went quiet in a way that answered my question. Daniel stood up. The warmth was gone now. Not replaced by anger, exactly, but by a kind of flat assessment that was, in some ways, worse. He looked at me the way he looked at a deal that had failed to close. "You're going to spend everything you have on lawyers," he said. "And at the end of it, you'll be alone here, and we'll be estranged. and nothing will have changed, except that we can't be there for you anymore." "You are not there for me," I said quietly. "You are there for the house." He walked to the door. Linda followed, setting the casserole on the entry table with a small, controlled motion that was somehow more communicative than anything she'd said. At the door, Daniel turned. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," I said. They left. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a long moment. The house was quiet around me, the familiar quiet of a place that knows you, the creak of the boards under my feet, the light through the east window making its usual late morning pattern on the floor. I was shaking slightly, I realized. Not with fear, exactly, though fear was part of it. The fear was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. My children had resources I didn't have: Daniel's money, Hartwell and Briggs, the ability to sustain a legal fight for longer than most people could withstand. I thought about what it would mean to lose. Not just the house, though that was enormous, but the right to remain myself. The right to wake up in my own bedroom and make my own coffee and tend my own garden and decide each day how I wanted to spend the hours I had left. That was what was actually at stake. Not square footage, not property values. The right to be a person rather than a problem to be managed. The fear moved through me, and it left something behind. I went to my desk and I opened the notebook. I was ready. The hearing was set for a Thursday in June. The Pima County Superior Court, Probate Division, Courtroom 4C. I drove myself there, which I mention not as a point of pride, but because it was noted in the record, noted by Robert Castillo as part of the day's proceedings, a detail that would matter later. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had seen courtrooms in films and on television, those high-ceilinged chambers that make everything feel like history. This was a working room, fluorescent light, institutional carpet, a gallery of plastic chairs. Daniel and Linda sat with their attorney, a man named Warren Blythe from Hartwell and Briggs, compact, silver-haired, with the air of someone who had won enough cases to find them slightly tedious. He glanced at me when I came in and looked back at his papers. I heard, later from Robert, that Blythe had said to Daniel before I arrived, "She has no chance. We have the documentation, we have the pattern, and elderly plaintiffs without family support don't tend to perform well under examination." The phrase that was repeated to me was, "She has no chance." I filed it away with the other things I knew. Judge Margaret Okafor was 60-something, deliberate, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular patience of someone who has seen many people attempt to use her courtroom as a substitute for conversations they should have had at home. Blythe presented first. He was good. I will give him that. He had assembled the documentation with care. The incidents Linda had recorded, the observations from those early months, statements from two of Daniel's contacts, a geriatric care manager who had evaluated me not at my request or my doctor's referral, but at Daniel's arrangement, through a process I had not been informed of and had not consented to. The care manager's report was 3 months old and described, on the basis of a 40-minute in-home visit in which I had cooperated pleasantly and answered all questions correctly, a person who was showing early indicators of social isolation and executive decline. Robert objected to the admissibility of that report. The judge reserved her ruling. Blythe concluded with something that would have been effective if I were the person he thought I was. A recounting, delivered with practiced sorrow, of 2 devoted children struggling to help a mother who had become, in her grief and her stubbornness, unable to see that she needed help. He described Daniel as a concerned son who had watched his mother grow increasingly isolated since his father's death. He described Linda as a devoted daughter living nearby. doing her best to maintain a connection that her mother seemed determined to sever. It was a portrait of a family at the end of its patience, rendered in sympathetic tones. I noticed that several of the factual details were technically accurate and entirely misleading, which is a specific skill that requires considerable practice. It was a good performance. Robert's presentation was different, methodical. He did not perform. He entered the neuropsychological evaluation from Dr. Reyes. He entered the clearance from Dr. Huang. He entered the letters from First Lutheran, the literacy program, the library. He entered Ruth's meticulous book club records, 14 meetings attended in 18 months, active participation documented in Ruth's schoolteacher handwriting. He entered the deed, the quiet title filing, and the record of the title search run by Hartwell and Briggs 6 weeks before I had been shown any brochure or had any conversation with my children about my future. That last item landed visibly. Judge Okafor looked at it for a longer moment than she looked at most documents. Then it was my turn. I was not required to speak. Robert had told me that, from the beginning, the burden of proof was on Daniel and Linda. I did not have to take the stand. But I had decided, weeks earlier, sitting in my kitchen with the notebook open in front of me, that I wanted to. Not for the judge, for myself. Because I had spent 18 months being discussed, evaluated, documented, and assessed by people who had never once asked me directly what I wanted. I wanted to speak in my own voice, in my own words, on the record. I walked to the stand. I sat. I folded my hands. Blythe approached. He was courteous. The professional courtesy of a man who is certain he is about to win. He asked me about my daily routine. I answered clearly. He asked about my finances. I described my accounts, my investment statements, my system for tracking household expenses, which I had maintained in a paper ledger since 1989. He asked whether I had any difficulty managing complex tasks. I told him I had prepared my own taxes for 42 years. He asked whether I felt capable of making major decisions independently. And here I want to tell you about the 3 words. Because what you might imagine, something dramatic, a revelation, a speech, is not what happened. What happened was this. Blythe asked the question, and I looked at him steadily, and I said, quite quietly, I already have. He paused. I'm sorry? I already have made major decisions independently, I said. I retained an attorney. I commissioned a neuropsychological evaluation. I filed a quiet title action. I gathered documentation of my medical history, my cognitive function, my social engagement, and my financial management, and I presented it to this court. I paused. I did all of that without assistance from my children, without guidance from anyone who stood to benefit from my decisions, and without anyone's permission. Another pause. I believe that answers your question. The gallery was very quiet. Judge Okafor had set down her pen. I saw her look not at Blythe, not at Daniel, but at the folder of documents on her desk, as if she were rechecking something she had already concluded. Her papers shifted in her hands, and one slipped to the desk with a soft sound that, in that silence, carried across the whole room. I saw Daniel at the table to my left, and for the first time in this entire proceeding, he looked like what he was, a man who had not prepared for the possibility of losing. Blythe attempted to continue. He asked about the burned burner, the missed birthday. I addressed both, calmly, with the dates and context I had recorded. He asked about my son's concern for my well-being. I said I had no doubt my son had concerns, and that I hoped he would have the opportunity to express them in a setting that didn't involve attempting to remove my legal autonomy. Blythe glanced back at Daniel once, a brief, involuntary look. And in that glance, I saw the first crack in his composure. He had been told this would be straightforward. He was recalculating. Judge Okafor removed her glasses. Judge Okafor spoke for 11 minutes. I know the exact duration because Robert timed it. He told me afterward, the way you note a detail that feels important even before you know why. 11 minutes without interruption, in a voice that was even and cool and left no ambiguity about what she had found or what she intended to do about it. She began with the petition itself. She found it insufficient. The medical evidence presented by the petitioners, Daniel and Linda, relied primarily on a single evaluation conducted without my consent or prior notice by a care manager retained and paid for by the petitioner based on a single brief home visit. She contrasted this with the evidence I had presented. A comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation by a licensed clinical psychologist at an accredited institution, a physician's statement from my primary care doctor of 9 years, and a substantial record of community engagement, social activity, and independent financial management. The standard for guardianship in the state of Arizona, she said, is not inconvenience. It is not the existence of a more efficient arrangement. It is not the preference of family members for outcomes that benefit them financially. She paused, looking briefly toward the petitioner's table. This court must find that the respondent is incapacitated. I do not find that. She turned to the title search. Here her voice did not change in volume, but something in its quality shifted. A slight hardening, the tone of a person who is about to say something that needs to be said, without softening. The record shows that a title search was conducted on the respondent's property by counsel for the petitioners approximately 6 weeks before any conversation was had with the respondent about her living situation or care needs. This court finds that timeline significant. It suggests that the petitioner's concern was not primarily with the respondent's welfare, but with the disposition of her assets. I heard Blythe murmur something to Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Linda, beside him, had her hands folded tightly in her lap and was looking at the table. I watched her absorb each sentence the way you watch someone absorb rain. She could not stop it, and she had stopped trying. The petition for guardianship is denied, Judge Okafor said. The petition for conservatorship is denied. The respondent retains full legal authority over her person and her property. She looked down at a document in front of her. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of the care manager's report to the state licensing board, given concerns about the circumstances of its preparation. Counsel for the petitioners is advised to review the ethical guidelines governing communications with unrepresented parties. That last sentence was directed at Blythe. He kept his expression neutral, but the hand resting on the table in front of him pressed slightly flatter against the surface. An involuntary stillness, the physical equivalent of catching yourself. I had watched enough people absorb bad news to recognize the reflex. He had not expected the referral. That was not a consequence he had priced into his calculation when he took this case. I looked at Daniel. He was sitting very straight. The composure was intact, the way a wall is intact after the mortar has already started to fail. Holding the shape, but changed underneath. He was a man who had been certain, completely and professionally certain, and who was now sitting in a courtroom that had just declared him wrong in writing, on the record, in language that would be available to any attorney who searched his name in connection with elder law proceedings. I do not know what he was thinking, but I know what certainty looks like when it breaks quietly, and I was watching it. Then she looked at me directly, which judges do not always do. "Miss Calloway," she said. "Calloway was Harold's name, and mine, and the name on the deed. This court finds no basis to disturb your independence. Your home is your home." I had promised myself I would not cry in that courtroom. I didn't, but it was close. Outside, in the corridor, Robert shook my hand with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done his job precisely as it needed to be done. I thanked him, not effusively, because he would not have wanted that, but genuinely. He had been worth every dollar of the retainer. Daniel and Linda came out of the courtroom behind us. Daniel looked as he always looked after a failed negotiation, composed, contained, already calculating the next move. But there was something different underneath it, something that didn't quite have a name, but that I recognized as the specific look of a person who had been certain of something and had been wrong. Not just legally wrong. Wrong about me. Wrong about who I was and what I was capable of and what I would do when it mattered. He had looked at me for 51 years and seen a mother, which is to say, someone whose existence was organized around his. He had not seen a person who had been quietly keeping records for 18 months and building a case with the thoroughness of a woman who had nothing to lose by being precise. Linda looked like she had been crying. Her sunglasses were already on, though we were still inside, which told me she had put them on before we reached the corridor. I stood in the courthouse hallway, and I waited to see if either of them would speak to me. Daniel walked past without making eye contact. Linda stopped. For a long moment, she stood there, and I thought she might say something. Apologize, perhaps, or explain, or simply acknowledge that something significant had passed between us that could not be undone by a casserole or a carefully rehearsed appeal to family. She didn't. She put on her sunglasses and walked toward the elevator. I watched them go. I felt no triumph. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something quieter. A settledness, like a door that has been left ajar for a long time, finally closing properly in its frame. Then I walked out of the Pima County Courthouse and into the June morning, which was bright and already hot in the way of Tucson summers, with the smell of creosote in the dry air and the sky a hard, cloudless blue overhead. I sat in my car for a few minutes, not from distress, from stillness, the particular stillness of a thing that is over. Then I drove home, to my house, on Elm Creek Road. With the oak tree Harold and I planted the year Daniel was born, and the yellow kitchen, and the pencil marks on the doorframe, and the third stair that creaks, mine. The summer after the hearing was the best summer I had had in years. The garden came in better than it had since before Harold got sick. I planted tomatoes along the south fence and put in a new bed of salvia near the patio. I had coffee on the back steps in the morning and watched the hummingbirds with a quietness I hadn't been able to find in a long time. The book club continued. We had added a fifth member, a woman named Diane, who had recently retired from teaching high school English and had opinions about everything, which suited us perfectly. We laughed more that summer than I remembered laughing in years. I continued my Wednesday volunteer work at the literacy program. One of my students, a man named Hector, 53 years old, learning to read for the first time, passed his first evaluation in September and shook my hand with a formality that undid me completely. I made a change to my will. Robert helped me draft it. The house, upon my death, would go to the Southern Arizona Land Trust, which preserves open desert and working agricultural land. Daniel and Linda were not excluded entirely. I am not a cruel woman, but they were no longer the primary beneficiaries of the property. I sent them each a letter informing them of this, not to cause pain, because they deserved to know. Neither of them responded. I heard, through the ordinary channels of a life lived in a community, how things went for them afterward. Daniel's business had a difficult year. He and Cheryl listed their Phoenix house for sale in October and moved to a smaller place in Scottsdale. Linda's situation was harder to hear about because it was sadder. Greg had still not found consistent work. The children were struggling. I thought about my grandchildren more than I thought about Linda and Greg. Children absorb what surrounds them. Linda called me once in November. She asked if I was well. I said I was. She asked about the garden. I told her about the salvia and the tomatoes. There was a pause. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. No elaboration, no defense. "I know," I said, and I meant it. I am not a person who requires groveling. What I required, and what I had obtained, was my autonomy. My right to be the author of my own life, in my own home, for whatever time I have remaining. In December, I had the oak tree properly trimmed for the first time since Harold died. The arborist told me it was in excellent health and would outlast both of us by a century. I made my coffee. I sat in the garden in the winter light. I thought, I'm still here, and I was glad. So that is my story. A house, 2 children, and 1 woman who refused to be erased quietly. What I learned is this: preparation is not stubbornness, it is dignity. Document everything. Know your rights. Find the people who will stand beside you. And when someone tells you that you have no chance, that is precisely the moment to prove them wrong. What would you have done in my place? Would you have signed those papers and walked away? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for staying until the end.